want to keep me feeling secure when I talk to you. So I'm very happy to be here tonight as a representative of the Stanford Virtual Human Interaction Lab. My name is Andrea Stevenson, and I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in the Department of Communication. My advisor is Jeremy Bailenson, who's the founder of the lab. Can you guys all hear me okay? Great, okay. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about virtual reality in general, what it is and what it can do. And after that, I'll talk you through some of the highlights of research that's been conducted in our lab. And if there's time, I'll talk to you about my particular area of interest, embodiment and media in general, and particularly in virtual reality. I'll talk about what that means and what we can use that concept for. And I'll try to be swift so that we can leave time for questions at the end of the talk. So how many people here have been in immersive virtual reality? So great, you've tried the Rift, maybe you visited a lab, visited our lab. So a substantial chunk of you have been, but for the rest of us, I'm going to go through a quick introduction of what virtual reality is and why it's so interesting both as a research tool and as a subject of research. So before we start, a little tiny bit about myself. I actually began my career as an artist with a BFA in sculpture. So my own interests have moved from physical sculptures to digital models to thinking about how people understand objects and themselves in virtual space. So I'm very excited to be speaking here tonight in an art context. So let's look at my slides. So what is virtual reality? And now I'm immediately going to escape from my PowerPoint and show you a movie. So this is a young man walking in a virtual reality environment. He's seeing stereoscopic images through the head-mounted display that he's wearing, and he's feeling vibrations through his feet, through a special kind of floor that we have in the lab. He's also hearing some noises from the speakers around the room. So he's just fallen into a pit. So this is what he's seeing. First he sees a digital version of the lab room that he can look around and walk around in that looks pretty much like the lab room, the physical lab room that he sees before he puts the HMD on. And then the floor opens and suddenly he sees this gaping pit that he's supposed to walk across. So you saw how he moved. Does he really think that he's going to fall into a pit? No, I mean, the visuals are good, but they're not that good. It's cognitively, he's aware that he's not actually in any danger. But his body doesn't know it. So his body is telling him, you're moving around this room and it changes as you look at it, just as in real life. When you walk up to the edge of this cliff, you can tell by moving your head around approximately how deep it is. And when you go out on that board, you can see the view shift as if you were walking right out in the middle of it. His body really doesn't want him to fall. And that's really the key to virtual reality. Even when you cognitively understand that it's a virtual environment and it's not real, your body takes that sensory input very seriously. And that's why we can do so many interesting things in the lab. Because even when we believe that it's not a real world, our body tells us otherwise. So virtual reality is very sensorially based. I want to talk about this idea of substituting digital information for the sensory information we normally get in the real world. So sight is huge up here because sight is far and away at this point the most important component of virtual reality. After that, we have sound or hearing. A little bit of touch, of haptics. That's a really interesting area that is getting explored more. And then we've got a couple of interesting instances where people use smell for VR. Taste, we don't use it. I think you guys can imagine why that's technically difficult at this point. So let's go ahead and go through these one by one. And I'm going to talk about three important components of creating a virtual experience using vision. And these are stereoscopy, resolution, and which is kind of graphic quality, and immersiveness. So stereopsis is the eye's ability to provide visual cues of depth. How many of you guys are familiar with that idea? 3D vision, right? So for those of you that have never tried this, it's kind of a fun example of how it works. Our brains understand depth by comparing the images they get from our two eyes. It's very easily demonstrated. So you can, with both your eyes open, you can hold up your finger so that it's covering the eye on the screen. And now close your left eye. So unless situation or they're looking down at a body that's different from their normal body, you want to have the environment be immersive so they're not getting contradictory information from the physical world. So those are 3 ways to think about how vision is important in VR. Sound is another really important and I think kind of underutilized sense in virtual reality. So our lab has 2 ways that it uses sound that I think we have used very effectively, but I think in general it's not what people think of right away when they think of virtual reality. So spatialized sound, either with headphones or with speakers around the world, can localize sound in this imaginary virtual space. So our lab has a demonstration that unfortunately I can't really bring with me, where you stand in the middle of the lab and you hear what sounds like a helicopter surrounding you, going outside around the lab by having the sound come from different speakers around the room. And you can also get similar effects by wearing headphones. But that's not all that we can do with sound. The other thing we can do is provide a little bit of haptic feedback, a little touch feedback by very low frequency vibrations in the floor. So in our lab, we have a somewhat flexible floor that's made of airplane steel. It has speakers in the corner of the room called butt kicker speakers that vibrate at low frequencies, and they actually make the floor vibrate. So when you see a helicopter or see the floor opening, so you're going to walk across the pit, you can get that rumbling sound, and it can be very effective in getting a sense of atmosphere. So that would be what I would call active haptic information, that vibration. But you can also have passive haptic feedback. So in this instance, this is a woman who's pretending to undergo therapy for arachnophobia. So she's seeing a giant spider in virtual reality. And she can also reach out and touch passively haptic spider model. So she can get that double sense where she reaches out and touches the spider, she can feel kind of a hairy, furry spider on her hands. And being able to double up that sensory information is really useful when you're trying to convince people's bodies that they're in a real environment. And finally, smell. So smell is underutilized for a reason that makes sense when you think about it. You can waft a smell in a room, but it's very hard to get rid of the smell. So it's not really a transient phenomenon. If you introduce a smell into your virtual reality scenario, it's pretty much going to be there until the end. But this can be really useful to evoke a sense of place, especially to evoke emotional memories, because smell is a very emotional sense. So it's used, our colleagues at USC use the smell of smoke when they're treating veterans for PTSD, because it's a very evocative sense. They can, when they create their battle scenes, they can not only use the haptic feedback, they can create vibrations, they can use sound to recreate the noises of battle, they can recreate the visuals, but they can also just have this background and smell of burning that can be very evocative for people in that situation. But for all of these senses to be effective, they need to relate to how the user is moving around in the world, because the most important component of virtual reality is that it's interactive. And that interactivity can go from just having the scene change as you move your head to having noises go off when you touch items in the digital world, to have, if you have a digital person in the room with you, to have that person react to your movements. So being able to track what the user is doing in VR is crucial. So in our lab, we use optical trackers, and you can see those on our participants' hands and feet there. And those track the position of his hand. So if he raises his hand like this, then we can draw his hand appearing in front of him in the virtual world. The same principle applies to his head, that can track his movements in space as he moves around the digital lab room in this case. And he also has an orientation tracker, so he can adjust his vision to the pitch, yaw, and roll as he moves his head around. So that all of that information goes into redrawing the scene so that what he expects to see as he moves his body around is actually what he sees in the HMD. So all of this is very expensive at this point, and we'll talk at the end why this is changing very, very rapidly. And it seems a little weird if you haven't been in virtual reality. It's like, why are you creating a slightly low resolution version of the real world? Anyway, we have a real world. So it's really good as a research tool, and it's also becoming more and more relevant as a subject of study itself. So immersive virtual reality has been expensive and sort of a feature of research institutions, not something that you have in your house, but we believe that that's about to change, especially with the advent of the Oculus Rift. I think has gotten the most press, but that, which is a new cheap virtual reality headset, but the fact that that's come on the market and got some attention has driven the development of a lot of other devices. So we've been saying this for many years, that virtual reality is just about to get big, but I'm going to predict within the year at this point. And once that happens, then we can start to talk about how virtual reality can be applied to improve everyday life. So here I have a picture of two digital people. And these can be avatars or agents. And what's nice about virtual reality is it allows us to disassociate what we look like and what we do in the real world with what we look like and what we do virtually. So I can wear an avatar that looks like me and moves like me, and I can communicate with you wearing your avatar that looks like you and moves like you, and we can use that to track and study our movements as if we were interacting in real life. Why do we think this would work? Because going back to the pit demo, we're going to automatically follow a lot of the same rules that we would in real life. It's going to be hard for me to invade the personal space of an avatar, even though I know consciously that it's just a digital person. I will have a hard time walking up and walking through that avatar body. I'll automatically tend to stay back and treat it as though it's a real person. So we can use that tendency of our body to take that seriously as to answer social psychology questions. But we can also use that for experimental purposes, knowing that people will react to a digital person as if they were real. We can create an agent, which is a digital person that's controlled by the computer. So then we can have a very nicely controlled experiment where the agent does the same thing again and again, and we can look at our result, the reaction of our participants to an agent that never varies. So I just got the 5-minute signal, so I'm going to see if I can zoom through a little. So what we can use this for is something called transformed social interaction. So this is the idea that we could reproduce real life in virtual reality to an extent. We can do more interesting things than that. This is an example. This slide here, you'll notice that some of these people are opaque, and some of these people look like they're kind of fading away. And this is a slide taken from a little experiment looking at using virtual reality to train teachers. So teachers are trained to pay attention to the whole room, right? Not to neglect the people on the sides. And anybody that's ever lectured or talked in front of a crowd realizes that that's difficult to do. So in this instance, the people that the teacher isn't paying attention to are starting to fade away. They're starting to ghost out because the teacher's head movements are being tracked, right, to create the virtual world. But because we're controlling what the teacher is seeing, we can change what is put into their vision. So we can show them where they're not looking, which is obviously something that we can't do in real life. So there's lots of different ways to use transformed social interaction. Another way example to think of, and this is something that may be coming up more as people begin to use representations of themselves to communicate, is I'm standing in front of you and I'm kind of pacing around. Maybe I can move my hands in a more graceful way. So if we were interacting in a virtual environment, then I could remove my natural hand movements and you have my avatar move much more gracefully in front of you. So, or if you guys wanted to be polite and appear as though you were interested, but you actually wanted to take the opportunity to check your email during my talk, that you could have a very, very attentive avatar nodding and smiling at my questions. You could totally be on your phone. You wouldn't have to hide it under the table at all. So right now, that sounds kind of fantastic, right? That's not something that we normally do because we're not interacting in that way. But remember that Facebook just bought Oculus Rift. So they didn't tell me what they were going to do with it, but they are primarily a social site. So I think that what they're predicting, maybe, what I'm predicting definitely, is that as these cheap hardware devices that are meant to be used for video games become used in people's houses, we're going to start seeing people applying them to all kinds of situations. So maybe they'll be using them to interact more, maybe they'll be a little, have an opportunity to be more embodied than you are in Skype. You can share a virtual space with someone. But I think that with that opportunity to communicate that way, we'll also see people trying to tweak the interaction. And I think that transformed social interaction is an example of the way that things could go. So to sum up, virtual reality allows us to create a digital world that seems real to an extent to its users because it substitutes the sensory information that creates a real world for us. And it creates a new digital world. So that's pretty cool. But it's been kind of an esoteric endeavor in the past. So I think that what's going to be interesting now is seeing how the affordances that I've described for virtual reality are going to be used when it enters the home and becomes more commercially used. So remember my words, I predicted a year you start to see more practical applications, and then maybe I can come back and tell you more about them.